Snow fell on Winterfell. Not the gentle snow of childhood, but wet, heavy flakes that stuck to everything. The courtyard was quiet. The banners hung still. The Night King was ash. The throne was melted. History would record these things as victories, as the close of one age and the start of another. But for the Starks who remained, the hardest part was just beginning. Sansa ruled an independent north that had no treasury, no harvest, and lords who remembered her as a girl. Jon walked into exile with a name he'd never wanted, and a sentence that felt like mercy until he tried to sleep at night. Arya sailed west with a crew who didn't trust her, and an ocean that didn't care. Bran sat a broken throne and felt himself becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore. The histories remember the wars. These are the stories that came after. The Winter Ledger. The great hall at Winterfell smelled of wet wool and burning pine. 23 northern lords sat at the long tables, their breath misting in the cold. Spring had come, the maesters said, but Winterfell stones held winter in their bones. They always would. Stone remembered the cold better than people did, held it closer, let it seep deeper with every passing year until even summer felt like a brief reprieve from the inevitable return. Sansa sat in her father's chair and felt the weight of carved direwolves under her hands. The wood was worn smooth by generations of Stark lords, dark with oil from palms and years and the slow accumulation of decisions made in this hall. She wore grey and white, practical colours, northern colours, and her hair was pinned back in the style her mother had favoured. A small detail, but one she'd learned mattered in ways that speeches and declarations never could. Men who wouldn't take orders from a girl would sometimes listen to an echo of Catelyn Stark, would hear the dead speaking through the living, and remember that the North had always been ruled by more than just the person in the chair. Lord Manderley had brought ledgers. 3 of them, bound in good leather, their pages marked with careful columns of numbers that wouldn't bend to hope or speeches, or the kind of royal displeasure that might have cowed him in another hall, in another time. He'd been talking for 10 minutes, his voice steady and reasonable in the way dangerous things often were. The kind of reasonable that came from knowing you were right, that the numbers were on your side, that arithmetic didn't care about loyalty or history, or the fact that a queen was glaring at you from her father's chair. The other lords listened with the stillness of men who'd already made up their minds, but wanted to hear it said aloud, wanted someone else to be the one to say it. Lord Cerwyn sat with his arms folded, his face set in the hard lines of a man who'd lost 2 sons to the wars and had no patience left for sentiment. Lord Glover looked older than he had a year ago, the kind of aging that came from too many funerals and not enough victories. A dozen lesser lords whose names Sansa had memorized, but whose faces still sometimes blurred together. They all wore the same expression, worried, wary, waiting. The problem was simple in the way impossible problems often were. 6,000 free folk, maybe 7, camped north of the Gift. Hunting game that should be feeding northern small folk. Burning wood that should be warming northern hearths. Eating food that wasn't there, that had never been there, that the North couldn't spare even if every harvest between now and the next long night came in full and perfect. Manderley laid it out with the patience of a maester explaining letters to a child. The harvest had been thin. Winter had been long, longer than anyone alive had seen, longer than the records went back, long enough that the oldest trees in the Wolfswood had rings that marked it as something unprecedented. The North had given everything to fight the dead. given food and men and weapons, and the kind of desperate, futile hope that came from knowing you were fighting for survival rather than victory. And now those stores were empty. The granaries held enough for a careful winter, maybe, if the summer harvest was good, if the autumn didn't turn early, if no one got greedy or careless or unlucky. The free folk had fought too, some of them, but they hadn't planted, hadn't sown, hadn't spent the spring working fields and mending fences and doing all the slow, grinding work that kept people fed when the snows came. They'd expected the North to provide, the way the North had always provided for the Watch, but the Watch was broken, and the North was empty, and expecting didn't fill bellies any more than hoping did. The murmurs of agreement started before Manderley finished speaking. Lord Selwyn made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either. The kind of non-committal noise that let him claim he'd been on the right side regardless of how things turned out. Lord Glover stared at his hands. The lesser lords shifted in their seats, looking at each other, waiting to see who would be the first to say what they were all thinking. Sansa kept her face still. That was something she'd learned in King's Landing, in the company of Cersei and Littlefinger, and all the others who taught her that showing weakness was the same as being weak, that the moment your face showed doubt, everyone watching would know they could push, could press, could take what they wanted, because you weren't sure enough to stop them. She'd practiced in front of mirrors until she could hear the worst news imaginable without so much as a flicker. Could be told her father was dead, her family scattered, her whole world ending, and keep her face as smooth and cold as a frozen lake. But the ledgers didn't lie. She'd learned that too. Numbers were honest in a way people never were. They didn't care about your name or your crown, or the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders. They just were. Simple, immutable, true. She asked to see the numbers herself. Manderley slid the ledgers across the table without hesitation. He'd expected this, had probably brought 3 copies to make the point impossible to ignore, to ensure that even if she tried to dispute the first set of numbers, the second and third would say the same thing. Grain stores, distributions, projections for the summer planting based on 3 different harvest scenarios. Good, average, poor. Salt fish and preserved meat, and the thin margins that separated survival from starvation in a land where winter could come at any moment and last for years. The arithmetic was bad in all 3 scenarios. If they maintained current rations for the free folk, White Harbour would go hungry by midwinter. Last Hearth would follow within a month. Even Winterfell, with its deep vaults and ancient stores and the accumulated surplus of centuries of careful planning, would feel the pinch before spring came again. And if they cut rations to the free folk, if they tried to solve the problem by simply giving less, there would be raids, or worse, a slow death by hunger, while the North watched and tried to pretend it wasn't happening, tried to pretend that letting people starve was different from killing them, that withholding food was somehow more civilized than putting a blade through their hearts. There were no good choices, only expensive ones, only decisions that would cost someone something, and the only question was who would pay and how much, and whether the price would be worth what they bought. Sansa closed the ledger slowly. Her hands were steady. That was practice. Everything was practice now. But inside she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came when the walls were closing in and the options were narrowing, and the weight of the crown felt less like honor and more like a stone around her neck. The hall waited. 23 northern lords and their retainers and the servants standing along the walls, all of them watching to see what their queen would do. Whether she'd make the hard choice, or try to wish the problem away with pretty words and royal proclamations that meant nothing when your belly was empty. She told them she would find another way. The words came out firm, certain, like she already knew what that way was and was simply choosing not to share it yet. Like this was a temporary setback rather than an impossible dilemma. The lords needed to hear that certainty, needed to believe their queen had a plan even if she didn't, needed something to hold on to besides the slow creeping fear that maybe this time there was no clever solution, no way out that didn't cost more than they could afford to pay. She dismissed the council with words that sounded more confident than she felt, used her mother's voice, her father's certainty, the accumulated weight of every Stark who'd ever sat in this chair, and made decisions that kept the North alive through winter after winter after winter. They left slowly, the way lords always did, when they wanted to show they were leaving by choice, and not because some slip of a girl had ordered them out. Lord Serwyn was first, his boots heavy on the stone floor. Lord Glover followed, then the lesser lords in ones and twos, talking quietly among themselves, their voices carrying just loud enough for Sansa to hear the doubt, the worry, the unspoken question of whether their queen actually had a plan or was just buying time. Manderley paused at the door. He looked back at her with something that might have been pity or sympathy, or simply exhaustion. It was hard to tell with Manderley, whose face had settled into permanent weariness sometime during the wars and never quite recovered. We cannot feed them. It's that simple. Then he was gone, and Sansa was alone in the great hall with the smell of wet wool, and the weight of arithmetic that wouldn't bend, and the echo of Manderley's words hanging in the cold air like a pronouncement of doom. She sat in her father's chair for a long time after the hall emptied, sat and stared at the ledgers and tried to think of something, anything, that would make the numbers add up differently, that would turn 6,000 people into a manageable burden instead of an impossible drain, that would let her keep her promises to the free folk without breaking her kingdom in the process. But the numbers didn't change, no matter how long she stared at them, no matter how many different ways she tried to arrange the columns and projections and careful arithmetic. The answer was always the same. There wasn't enough. There had never been enough. And unless something changed, unless she found some source of food or coin or labor that didn't exist, people were going to die. The only question was, which people, and who would decide? Sansa's solar was cold. She kept it that way deliberately, had ordered the servants to bank the fire low and leave the window cracked just enough to let in the bite of northern air. Clear thinking required a clear head, and warmth made her sleepy, made her thoughts drift toward comfort and drowsiness instead of the sharp focus she needed for the work ahead. She'd learned that from Cersei, though she'd never admit it aloud. There were dozens of small lessons from King's Landing that she used daily, bits of cruelty and calculation that had kept her alive then and kept her kingdom stable now. She'd taken what she needed from her enemies and tried not to think too hard about what that meant, about what it said about her that she could use their methods without flinching, could be cold and calculating when she needed to be, could make decisions that would have horrified the girl she'd been before the wars taught her that survival required compromise. She sat at her desk and stared at blank parchment. 3 attempts lay crumpled in the corner, each one too desperate or too proud or too something. This was harder than speeches, harder than council meetings where she could read faces and adjust her words in real time. A letter was permanent, could be read and reread, could be shared with advisors or enemies or anyone else the recipient chose, could be used against her if she wasn't careful, if she showed too much weakness or asked for too much help, or gave any indication that the North wasn't as strong and independent as she claimed. She was writing to Tyrion Lannister, and every word had to be perfect. Their correspondence over the past year had been carefully neutral. Trade agreements phrased in language so dry and formal it could have been written by Meisters. Border questions that touched on jurisdiction and precedent without ever acknowledging the deeper truth that the North's independence was still fragile, still new, still something that could be taken away if the South decided it was more trouble than it was worth. The polite fiction that they were simply two leaders maintaining diplomatic relations, nothing more. Not former spouses in a marriage neither had wanted. Not allies who'd once fought on the same side. Just queen and hand, corresponding about matters of state. But this letter would be different. This was her asking for help without admitting she needed it. Proposing partnership without surrendering the pride that was all that kept the Northern Lords from questioning whether independence had been worth the cost. The quill scratched against parchment. She kept her words careful, her tone measured, walking the line between formal and friendly that would let Tyrion read between the lines without giving him anything concrete he could use if their interests ever diverged. She wrote about the gift and its challenges, phrased not as a crisis, but as an opportunity, a chance to develop lands that had lain fallow for too long. She wrote about the free folk settling there, framing it as a resource rather than a burden, skilled hunters and trappers who knew the northern wilderness better than any Southron lord ever could. She didn't mention the council, didn't mention Manderley's ledgers, or the anger building in the small folk, or the way some of the lesser lords had started looking at her with doubt in their eyes. Those were northern problems, internal matters, and admitting them to a southern hand would make her look weak, would make it seem like she couldn't handle her own kingdom, couldn't manage the very independence she'd fought for. Instead, she proposed trade. The North had timber, good strong pine that the South needed for shipbuilding, for reconstruction, for all the building that had to happen now that the wars were over and people were trying to put their world back together. They had wool and furs, iron from the mountain clans, fish from White Harbor. These were resources, not problems, assets, not liabilities. And if the Crown were to establish a trade route through the gift, staffed and supplied by Southern coin, it would benefit both kingdoms. The free folk would find work instead of waiting on charity. Northern lords would see profit instead of burden. King Bran would have the materials his realm needed to rebuild. Everyone would win. That was the theory, at least. The hope she was building this letter around. That she could solve the North's crisis without admitting it was a crisis. Could get the help she needed without asking for help. Could maintain her kingdom's independence while accepting Southern coin to prop it up. She read the letter 3 times before sealing it, checking each line for weakness, for anything that could be misread or used against her. The word friendship felt like ash in her mouth when she wrote it at the close, but it was the right word. Tyrion would understand what she meant by it. Mutual respect without affection, cooperation without trust, the careful dance of 2 people who'd been married once and had learned to navigate the complicated aftermath. They'd been husband and wife in a ceremony neither wanted, had shared a bed without ever truly sharing anything that mattered, and somehow that shared humiliation had created something almost like understanding between them. She sealed the letter with red wax and pressed her ring into it, called for a rider she trusted, a man who'd served her father, who'd carried messages for Robb during the wars, who understood that some things weren't to be spoken about in taverns or common rooms, watched him tuck the letter into his saddlebag and ride south into the gathering dusk. Then she waited. Waiting was its own kind of torture. The days stretched out while the stores dwindled and the lords grew more restless, and the free folk continued eating food the North couldn't spare. Sansa filled the time with other work, settling disputes between merchants in the winter town, reviewing accounts from the castle's household, visiting the small folk to show her face and remind them that their queen was watching, that someone cared about their troubles, even if there wasn't much that could be done to solve them. She smiled at children and listened to grievances, and tried not to think about Manderley's ledgers, tried not to calculate how many days of food were left, how many weeks until the crisis became acute, how long she could keep pretending everything was under control before someone, Manderley or Tywin, or one of the lesser lords, decided she wasn't capable of ruling and tried to take the decision out of her hands. The reply arrived 6 weeks later, carried by a royal messenger who looked exhausted from the road. The man had ridden hard, changing horses at every way station, sleeping rough when he had to. The kind of speed that meant Tyrion thought this was important, that he'd read her letter and understood what she was really asking, and decided it was worth the effort of a fast response. Tyrion's handwriting was messier than hers, the letters cramped and hurried in the way of someone who had too many thoughts and not enough time to write them all down. But the words were careful, precisely chosen, the kind of language that diplomats used when they wanted to say yes without committing to anything they couldn't back out of later. He'd brought her proposal to the king. Bran had seen merit in it. Of course he had. Bran saw merit in everything, saw the future and the past, and all the tangled possibilities between, though his small council had concerns about cost. There was always concern about cost. The South was rebuilding too, dealing with its own shortages and crises, and every coin spent on northern trade routes was a coin that couldn't be spent on fixing King's Landing sewers or rebuilding the harbour at Lannisport, or any of the 1,000 other projects that screamed for attention and funding. But Tyrion had made the argument, had reminded the small council that winter was coming. It always was. That was the North's oldest truth. And when it came, the South would need timber for fires and wool for warmth, and all the things that only the North could provide in sufficient quantity. Better to establish the trade routes now, during the summer, when the work was easier and the roads were passable. Better to build relationships with the free folk, while there was still time to do it peacefully, before hunger and desperation turned them into the raiders they'd been for centuries before the wars changed everything. The argument had carried weight. Or maybe Bran had simply decided it should carry weight, had seen some future where this arrangement mattered and nudged his council toward accepting it. With Bran, it was impossible to know where persuasion ended and foresight began. The Crown would offer a trade commission, funded equally by both kingdoms. Northern lords would contribute timber rights and labour, the things they had in abundance even when food was scarce. The South would provide coin for roads and way stations, for the infrastructure that would turn isolated camps into connected communities. The free folk would be employed at fair wages, enough to buy food rather than take it, enough to turn them from burden into participants in an economy that benefited everyone. Half the profits would return to the North, half to the Crown, an equal partnership, at least on parchment. In practice, Sansa knew, the South would probably take more than half. There would be fees and tariffs and administrative costs that somehow always seemed to flow south rather than north. But even a third of the profits would be enough to ease the crisis, would turn the arithmetic from impossible to merely difficult. There was one condition. Small, Tyrion wrote, but important to the king. The arrangement must include formal recognition of the Night's Watch, not as it had been, with its vows and its wall and its black-clad brothers, but as it could be. A ranging force, scouts beyond the wall, watching for threats that might not be visible from the south, keeping an eye on the cold places where things still moved in the dark. Jon had proved the value of that. Bran wouldn't forget it. Couldn't forget it, probably. Not when he could see the past and future and knew what happened when people stopped watching the north. Sansa read the letter twice, set it down, picked it up again, read it a third time, looking for the trap, the hidden cost, the thing she was missing that would make this arrangement turn sour. The condition was clever. Bran was always clever, even when, especially when, he pretended not to be. It gave Jon purpose without giving him power. Let him keep ranging and watching and doing the things he was good at, without putting him in a position where he could threaten anyone's authority. It made the free folk useful without making them citizens, gave them a role that the North could accept without having to acknowledge them as equals. And it reminded everyone, lords and small folk and the free folk themselves, that the wall still mattered, that watching for threats was different from hiding behind stone, that there were things in the north that needed watching whether there was a wall or not. She spent 3 days working through the numbers with Lord Manderley, who grumbled and complained and found a dozen reasons why it wouldn't work, before finally admitting that yes, if they were very careful and very lucky, the Trade Commission could solve their problem. It would take 5 years to turn a real profit, but it would keep people fed in the meantime, would turn resentment into employment, burden into opportunity, crisis into something manageable. It wouldn't be easy, nothing ever was, but it was possible, and possible was more than she'd had a week ago. She wrote back to Tyrion, kept it short. One word, carefully, penned in the center of the parchment, her hand steady despite the relief flooding through her chest. Agreed. The ink dried quickly in the cold air of her solar. She sealed it and sent it south and felt something loosen inside her. Not relief. It was too early for that. Too many things could still go wrong. But possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a way through. That the crisis wasn't over, but it wasn't unsolvable either. Later, she would learn that Tyrion had spent 2 weeks convincing Bran's small council, that he'd traded favors and made promises and burned through political capital he'd been saving for other uses, all to make her proposal work, that he'd argued until his voice gave out and then argued some more, until even the hardest skeptics had to admit that the Trade Commission made sense. He never mentioned any of that in his letters, never asked for thanks or acknowledgement or anything in return, just sent his agreement and moved on to the next crisis, the next problem that needed solving. Sansa knew anyway. She'd learned to read what people didn't say, to see the effort behind the easy words, to understand that sometimes the greatest kindnesses were the ones that went unacknowledged. She didn't write to thank him. That would have been admitting too much, would have shifted the balance of their relationship in ways she couldn't afford. But she filed it away, this debt she owed, this favor that would need repaying someday. The North remembered. That was their oldest saying, their truest promise. And Sansa Stark would remember this. The trouble came in late summer, when the heat lay heavy over the north and made everything feel slower, thicker. The kind of heat that was rare this far north but not impossible, that made people short-tempered and careless in equal measure. A wildling, people were still calling them that, though Sansa had tried to stop it, had insisted on free folk in her pronouncements and declarations even, though she knew the old words had weight that new ones never would, had settled on abandoned farmland near Last Hearth. The land had been empty for years, fallow, forgotten. Its owner had died fighting for Robb Stark, and his son had died in the wars that followed, and his grandson had supposedly died too, though no one had ever found a body. The land had grown wild, the fields returning to forest, the old stone walls crumbling under the weight of winters no one was there to maintain them. It looked abandoned. It looked like it belonged to no one. The wildling, his name was Ragnar, though most people didn't bother learning it, had cleared it, turned the soil, planted barley in neat rows that showed he knew farming, even if he'd spent most of his life hunting and raiding. Built a small house from timber he'd cut himself, solid enough to survive a northern winter if the winds weren't too harsh. It was good work, honest work, the kind of work the North desperately needed if it was going to feed itself through the next few years. Then the grandson came back. Turns out he hadn't died at all. He'd been wounded, captured, held in some southern dungeon until the wars ended, and his captors decided he wasn't worth the trouble of keeping. He'd walked home, all the way from the Riverlands, and found a wildling living in his grandfather's house and working his grandfather's land. The details got confused in the telling, the way details always did when violence was involved and everyone had a reason to lie. Ragnar claimed the land was empty, abandoned, free for the taking, and by any reasonable measure, he was right. No one had worked that soil in 5 years. No one had lived in that house or mended those walls, or done anything to suggest they still had a claim to it. He'd asked around in Last Hearth, or so he said, and no one had objected. No one had said the grandson was still alive. The grandson said it was his by right of inheritance, left to him in his grandfather's will, even though he'd been gone for years, even though everyone had assumed he was dead, even though by the time he came back, someone else had already made it productive again. There was shouting, accusations, the kind of argument that started with property and ended with pride, with neither man willing to back down because backing down meant admitting weakness, and weakness in the north could kill you faster than winter. The grandson drew a knife. That much was agreed upon by everyone who told the story, though they differed on whether he'd meant to threaten or actually use it. Ragnar's dog killed him, just like that. One moment there was shouting. The next, there was a dead man and a dog with blood on his jaws, and a wildling standing there with a slow realization that everything had just gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Lord Umber brought Ragnar to Winterfell himself, came with 12 men and an iron cage on a cart, like he was bringing back a prize from a hunt. Brought the dog too, also caged, both of them rattling through the gates of Winterfell while the small folk gathered to watch and whisper and speculate about what the Queen would do. Put them both in the dungeons, left them there to await the Queen's justice, which everyone knew meant death. The law was clear, had been clear for centuries. Kill a northern man on northern land, and the sentence was death. It didn't matter that the dead man had drawn first. Didn't matter that the dog had done the killing rather than Ragnar himself. The law didn't care about such distinctions. The great hall was packed when Sansa heard the case. Northern lords on one side, free folk on the other, and between them a gap as wide as the wall had been. The tension was physical, something you could feel pressing against your skin like humidity before a storm. Everyone knew this case mattered, that it was about more than one dead man and one wildling in chains. It was about whether the free folk would get northern justice or northern mercy. Whether the promises made after the war, that they'd be protected, integrated, given a chance to belong, meant anything when it came down to actual law and actual consequences. Sansa sat in her father's chair and felt the weight of every eye in the room. The northern lords watching to see if she'd uphold their laws. The free folk watching to see if she'd honor her promises. And somewhere in the middle, Ragnar in his chains, standing between two guards with a face that showed no fear and no hope, just the blank acceptance of a man who'd already decided how this would end. Lord Umber presented the facts with cold precision. The land belonged to House Umber, belonged to the grandson by right of inheritance, by law, by every tradition the North held sacred. Ragnar had no claim to it, had taken it without permission, without even asking. A northern man was dead because of that. The law was clear. The sentence was death. It was that simple, or it should have been. The Hull waited, silent except for the creak of wood and the rustle of cloth and someone coughing in the back, waiting to see what their queen would decide. Sansa looked at Ragnar, really looked at him, not just seeing the wildling in chains, but the man underneath. He had scars on his face, the kind that came from living hard and fighting often. His hands were calloused from work, recent work, the kind of calluses you got from swinging an axe and turning soil and building something with your own sweat and labor. He looked like Jon in a way that made her chest tight. Not in features. Jon was dark and lean where Ragnar was broad and weathered, but in bearing, in the way he stood like a man who'd done what he had to and wouldn't apologize for surviving. She asked about the land, the facts. Ragnar confirmed what Umber had said. Yes, he'd claimed it. Yes, he'd worked it. No, he hadn't known it belonged to anyone because it had been empty for years and in the world he came from. Empty land was free land. The idea that someone could own a thing they weren't using, that a claim could persist for years without anyone there to enforce it, was foreign to him. Absurd even. The law didn't care. Northern law was built on ownership and inheritance, and the careful preservation of claims that stretched back centuries. It was what kept the North stable, what prevented every estate from dissolving into chaos when a lord died, or a war scattered families across the realm. But it was also what created situations like this, where a man who'd worked hard and asked around and done everything that seemed reasonable could still be wrong, could still be guilty, could still deserve death for the crime of not understanding the rules. Ragnar told her he wouldn't apologize for surviving. His voice was steady, not defiant exactly, just tired, like he'd spent his whole life hearing that he'd broken rules he didn't know existed, and this was just one more time. The free folk in the hall shifted, watching, waiting. Some looked angry, some looked scared. All of them looked like they were calculating how far they'd get if they tried to rush the guards and break Ragnar free. The northern lords looked angry too, but in a different way. The kind of anger that came from seeing their laws questioned, their traditions challenged, the whole careful structure of northern society threatened by the idea that maybe, just maybe, those old rules didn't make sense anymore. Sansa felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word and the hall would erupt. One decision that looked too weak or too harsh, and she'd lose the faith of half the people watching. There was no right answer, only expensive ones. She made her ruling, delivered it in her mother's voice, calm and certain, like she'd spent days weighing the options, and this was the only possible conclusion. The law required payment in blood. A man was dead. That couldn't be ignored, couldn't be pardoned, couldn't be swept away with pretty words about understanding and mercy. The sentence was death, for the dog, not the man. The hall erupted, voices rising, northern lords shouting that it wasn't enough, free folk shouting that it was too much, everyone with an opinion, and most of them angry about something. Sansa waited for the noise to die, her hands gripping the arms of her father's chair hard enough to hurt. She spoke over the dying tumult. The dog had killed a man. That was fact, undisputed. The kind of truth that even people who disagreed about everything else had to acknowledge. The law required payment. The dog would be executed. As for Ragnar, she let her gaze settle on him, saw him watching her with those careful eyes. He would be released. The land would be returned to House Umber, as law and inheritance demanded. But in exchange, he would be given other land. Farther north, crown land that Sansa could grant freely, without needing permission from lords or councils or anyone else. He'd work it for 3 years. After that, it would be his. Lord Umber started to protest. His face was red, his voice rising with the kind of anger that came from being contradicted in public, from having his perfectly reasonable demand for justice turned into something more complicated than it should have been. But Sansa cut through his objections with a question that made him pause, made everyone pause, made them all think about what they were really arguing for. Was he suggesting that a man's life was worth less than land? He couldn't say yes to that, not in public, not in front of the other lords and the free folk and all the witnesses who would carry that answer back to their homes and taverns and tell the story of Lord Umber saying a piece of land mattered more than a human life. The ruling stood. The free folk left with wary relief on their faces. Not satisfaction. This wasn't the justice they would have chosen, wasn't the outcome that made sense in their world, but acknowledgement that it could have been worse. That their man was alive at least, even if his dog wasn't. The northern lords left angry, but not rebellious. Sansa had given them their land back, had upheld the principle that ownership mattered and law mattered, and you couldn't just take what you wanted because it looked empty. That was enough to maintain their pride, even if they thought the punishment was too light. The crisis was managed, peace maintained, both sides unhappy, which probably meant she'd found the right middle ground. Ragnar was released from his chains. He left without looking at her, his face unreadable. She didn't know if he understood what she'd done, if he realized she'd chosen his life over easy justice, had risked her authority with the northern lords to give him another chance, or if he just felt the weight of losing a dog that had probably been his companion for years. The dog was killed an hour later. Sansa had ordered it done quickly, quietly, away from the hall and the crowds. The headsman was efficient. One stroke, clean and fast, the way executions were supposed to be, when you weren't trying to send a message. Brienne witnessed it because someone had to, because proof mattered when it came to sentences carried out, and Brienne was one of the few people Sansa trusted to do it properly. Brienne reported back afterward. Her face was carefully neutral, the way it got when she was trying not to show emotion, but she told Sansa things she didn't need to know. Details that weren't in the official record. How the dog had been old, grey around the muzzle, with the kind of patient eyes that came from years of loyalty. How it had licked Ragnar's hand through the bars when he'd come down to say goodbye. how Ragnar had stood there afterward, staring at nothing, his face empty in the way faces got when grief was too large for expression. Late that night, long after the hall had emptied and the castle had settled into the quiet sounds of stone cooling and guards changing watch, Sansa sat in her solar. The fire had burned down to embers, just a faint glow in the hearth that did almost nothing to warm the room. She preferred it that way. The cold helped her think, kept her sharp. She'd won. That was what people would say tomorrow, what the Meisters would write in their records of her reign. Queen Sansa had resolved a difficult case with wisdom and mercy, had found a solution that satisfied both northern law and the need to integrate the free folk, had maintained her authority while showing clemency. It would be written up as a success, a demonstration of good governance. But Ragnar's dog had been killed an hour after sundown, old and loyal and guilty of nothing except protecting its master. Sansa had ordered it done, had watched Brienne leave to carry out the sentence, had sat in her chair and waited for the report that it was finished. She sat in the dark now and thought about that, about the price of justice when you were the one setting terms, about how easy it was to trade lives, even a dog's life, for stability, for peace, for the appearance of fairness that kept the realm from tearing itself apart. She'd learned this in King's Landing, learned that ruling meant making choices that would haunt you. That kept you awake at night. That made you wonder if the person staring back from the mirror was still someone you recognized, or if the crown had slowly, inexorably, turned you into something else. Cersei had understood that, had told her once, during one of their carefully venomous conversations, that queens didn't get to keep their hands clean. That power meant choosing who suffered and how much, and the only difference between a good ruler and a bad one was whether you agonized over those choices or enjoyed them. Sansa didn't enjoy them, but she made them anyway, and she was getting better at it, better at calculating the cost, at weighing lives and laws and consequences, at deciding that yes, a dog's death was worth preventing a war. That stability was worth a man's grief. That justice sometimes meant trading one kind of wrong for another kind of wrong and calling it mercy. She reached for parchment, started to write to Jon, to tell him about the choice she'd made, to ask if it was the right one, if this was what ruling had felt like for him back when he'd been Lord Commander, when he'd had to make decisions that kept people alive but cost something precious anyway. Jon, today I ordered a dog killed to save a man's life. The dog was old and loyal and had done nothing except protect someone it loved. I keep thinking about it, about whether there was another way, about whether I'm becoming the kind of person who can make these choices without feeling them. She stopped, read what she'd written. It looked childish on the page, needy, like she was asking for permission to feel bad about doing what needed to be done. Jon had made his choice, had walked away from this, from the crown and the weight and the night sitting alone wondering if you'd done right. He'd chosen the freedom of the North over the responsibility of ruling it. And maybe that made him wiser than she was. Or maybe it just made him different. Someone who couldn't live with the compromise and calculation that kept kingdoms running. She crumpled the letter, threw it in the fire, watched the parchment curl and blacken and turn to ash, the words disappearing like they'd never been written. The only person who could tell her if she was right was herself. And some nights, most nights, if she was honest, that person didn't know, couldn't know, could only sit in the dark and feel the weight of a dead dog and a living man, and the complicated arithmetic that said one was worth the other. Outside, snow was starting to fall, She could hear it against the window, a soft whisper like the castle itself was trying to tell her something. Winter was coming again. Not the long night, not the kind of winter that brought the dead, but the regular northern winter that killed you just as dead if you weren't prepared. And she would be here when it came, sitting in this solar, making choices that kept people alive and cost her pieces of herself she couldn't name. This was what she'd wanted, what she'd fought for. An independent North, a crown of her own, the power to make things right. She just hadn't understood, back when she was young, and thought ruling meant wearing nice dresses and being kind to people, that making things right sometimes meant making them wrong first, that justice and mercy were different things, and choosing between them was the work of every day, every decision, every moment she sat in her father's chair and pretended to be sure. The work didn't stop because she felt hollowed out. The work was what hollowed you out in the first place, made you into someone who could order a dog killed without your voice shaking, who could balance lives and laws like they were numbers in a ledger, who could sleep at night despite knowing that every choice you made meant someone, somewhere, lost something they'd never get back. Sansa sat in the dark until the sky began to lighten. Then she got up, washed her face in cold water that stung and woke, and reminded her she was still alive, still here, still responsible. Put on her crown, the simple one, steel and direwolves, nothing ostentatious, dressed in grey wool and fur that would keep her warm through another day of ruling. She had a meeting with the Trade Commission representatives at midday, letters to answer, disputes to settle, a kingdom to run. And if she looked tired, well, everyone looked tired these days. The war had done that, had made exhaustion so common that no one remarked on it anymore, had made the shadows under people's eyes just another feature of the landscape, like snow or stone, or the weight of winter that never quite left. She went to breakfast, smiled at the servants who brought her bread and cheese and weak ale, discussed the day's schedule with Brienne, who mentioned nothing about the dog or the execution, or the look on Ragnar's face when they'd led his companion away. Reviewed reports about the harvest in the winter town. Good news, for once, the crops coming in better than expected. Small mercies, small victories, the kind of thing you held on to when the larger picture was too overwhelming to face. At midday, she met with the first group of free folk who would be employed by the Trade Commission. They were wary, uncertain, dressed in furs and leathers that marked them as outsiders, even though they'd fought and bled for the North. They didn't trust Southern promises or Northern queens, but they needed work, needed food, needed a place to belong. Sansa explained how it would work, the roads they'd build, the way stations they'd maintain, the wages they'd earn, good wages, fair wages, enough to support families and build homes and start thinking about futures instead of just surviving winters. She spoke in the same calm, certain voice she'd used in the Great Hall, the voice that said everything was under control. One of them, an older woman with white hair and sharp eyes and the kind of face that had seen too much and survived anyway, asked if this was charity. Her voice made it clear what she thought of charity, what all of them thought of it. Sansa said no. This was work, fair pay for honest labor. The North needed roads. The free folk needed employment. This was trade, not kindness, an exchange that benefited both sides. The woman seemed satisfied with that answer. Charity required gratitude, required deference, required pretending that the person giving was better than the person receiving. Trade just required competence, and the free folk had competence in abundance, whatever else they might lack. After the meeting, Sansa walked the battlements. The wind was cold, carrying the smell of approaching winter, even though autumn was barely begun. Below, in the yard, she could see people going about their work. Servants carrying water, guards drilling, a blacksmith shoeing horses, the ring of hammer on anvil steady and rhythmic and oddly comforting. Ordinary life, the kind that kept happening regardless of what choices queens made in their solars. She thought about Ragnar, about whether he'd accept the land she'd granted him, or if he'd disappear north like so many free folk did when southern laws got too complicated, when the weight of civilization pressed too hard against the freedom they'd known before the wars changed everything. She thought about the grandson who died, whose grave would be marked and mourned by House Umber, whose death would be counted as justice served, even though justice felt like an inadequate word for what had actually happened. And she thought about the dog, old and loyal and dead for the crime of protecting someone it loved. That was the part that stayed with her, not the legal questions or the political calculations or the careful balance she'd struck between northern law and merciful clemency. Just the dog, the way it had licked Ragnar's hand through the bars, the way Brienne had described it, voice carefully neutral, as if reporting a fact rather than delivering a weight Sansa would carry for the rest of her life. Some prices were worth paying. She believed that, had to believe it, or the crown would have crushed her years ago. But believing something didn't make it easy, didn't make it hurt less when you counted up the cost and realized how much you'd spent. The wind picked up, pulling at her cloak and hair. She stood on the battlements and watched the north stretch out before her, vast and cold and beautiful and hers. Hers to protect, hers to rule, hers to break herself against, one choice at a time. That was what she'd wanted, what she'd fought for. And if the cost was higher than she'd expected, well, that was the price of getting what you wanted, of keeping it, of making it mean something beyond just a crown and a throne and a title that could be taken away as easily as it had been granted. She stayed on the battlements until the sun began to set. Then she went back inside, back to her solar, back to the work that never ended. The ledgers were still there, waiting. The next crisis would come soon enough. It always did. But for now, for tonight, she'd managed. She'd found a way through, had made the hard choice and survived it, and would wake up tomorrow to make more hard choices, because that was what ruling was. Not the crown or the throne or the grand pronouncements, just the quiet accumulation of choices, the slow wearing down of certainty, the gradual understanding that doing right sometimes meant doing wrong, and living with that paradox was the real test of whether you deserved to rule. Sansa sat at her desk and opened the first ledger. The numbers were still bad, but numbers could be managed, made to balance eventually, if you were willing to pay the price. She picked up her quill and started working. Outside, the snow fell faster. Winter was coming. It was always coming, and she would be ready. The message. The bird arrived on a morning when the sky was the color of old iron. Jon was checking snares with Tormund a mile north of the camp, working through the forest in the easy silence that came from years of ranging together. Ghost ranged ahead of them, a white shadow moving through the pines, his presence more felt than seen. Then Ghost stopped, his massive head turned south, watching. They found the raven perched on a pine branch near the edge of camp, a ranging bird, black as shadow, the kind the Night's Watch had bred for centuries. Someone had tied a message cylinder to its leg. Jon held out his arm without thinking. Old habit. Ravens knew him. The bird hopped onto his forearm, surprisingly heavy, and fixed him with one black eye that seemed to know more than birds should. He untied the message, broke the wax seal. The paper was cheap, the writing careful and measured. He recognized the hand. Larn, Ed's replacement. The message was short, formal. It ordered Jon Snow to return to Castle Black and resume his duties as a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. His sentence had been exile to the Watch, not release from his vows. The Lord Commander expected compliance within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in charges of desertion and the appropriate sentence: execution. Jon read it twice. The words didn't change. He'd been here 8 months, long enough to stop counting days, long enough that his hands had stopped reaching for a sword every morning and started reaching for an axe instead, long enough that the free folk had stopped treating him like Jon Snow, the king in the north, and started treating him like someone who might actually stay. He'd found something in the real north that Castle Black had never given him. Not purpose, not duty, something quieter, something that felt almost like peace. He pulled out his flint, set the message on a flat rock, struck sparks until the paper caught fire. They watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. The raven watched them with its 2 knowing eyes. Jon shooed it away. It circled twice, then flew south, carrying nothing. Tormund said they'd send another. Jon knew he was right, but he'd burn those too, as many as they sent. He'd taken the black once, sworn vows he'd meant with his whole heart, but the Watch had used him up and spat him out, had sent him north to die quietly, where his name wouldn't complicate southern politics. Now they wanted him back, not because they needed him, because having Lord Commander Jon Snow was better for recruiting than having nobody. But Jon Snow was done being used. He walked back to camp with Tormund, Ghost padding beside them. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that promised winter even though spring had supposedly come. This was home now, the forest and the cold and the free folk who didn't care about his name or his blood, who judged him on what he did rather than what he'd been. The Watch could send all the ravens it wanted. He was staying. 3 weeks later, Tormund came to Jon's tent at dawn. One look at his face told Jon this wasn't a social visit. The man's usual easy humor was gone, replaced by something careful and still. They walked for an hour through forest that grew thicker and older with every step. The pines were ancient here, their trunks wider than a man could wrap his arms around, their branches so dense the forest floor stayed in permanent twilight. Ghost padded ahead, but his behavior was wrong. His ears kept swiveling, his hackles raised and lowered in an irregular rhythm, like the direwolf couldn't decide if there was danger here or just wrongness. Tormund stopped at the edge of a clearing, gestured forward without speaking. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, perfect white snow, undisturbed. No tracks, no droppings, no signs that anything lived here. In a forest full of rabbits and deer and birds, this emptiness was impossible. Jon stepped forward. The air changed immediately, colder, not weather cold, something else, something that went through his furs and leathers and skin and settled in his bones. He could feel it in his teeth, in his joints, in the space behind his eyes. Tormund warned him not to go too far, said it got worse. Jon walked to the center anyway. The cold increased with every step. By the time he reached the middle, his breath was freezing in his lungs, burning on the way in and crackling on the way out. His fingers were going numb despite his gloves. He knelt, put his hand on the snow, Wrong. All of it wrong. The snow wasn't just cold. It was dead. Like it had forgotten it was supposed to melt, forgotten it was part of the world. It felt like absence, like a hole in the world that cold had rushed in to fill. He stood quickly, backed away. The cold eased as he retreated, but he could still feel it. Tormund asked how long it had been like this. A week, maybe 2. One of the hunters had found it. Then his dog had wandered in and never wandered out. Tormund pointed. There, at the edge of the clearing, a dark shape in the snow. They approached carefully. The dog was frozen solid, frost coating its fur until it looked carved from ice. Its eyes were open, staring at nothing. Jon touched it. Solid as stone, like it had been dead for months instead of days. The Night King was gone. Jon had watched him shatter, but the Night King had been in the world for 8,000 years. That much magic didn't just vanish. It left marks, scars, places where the world had been wounded so deeply it couldn't quite heal. This was one of those places. A wound where the Night King's magic had been, where it still was in some diminished form. Not alive, just there, like the echo of a scream in an empty room. Jon didn't know if it would grow or shrink or stay the same. All he knew was that it needed watching. They spent the afternoon setting stakes around the clearing's edge, painting them with symbols the free folk would recognize. Stay away. Death here. Jon started checking the cold spot every week after that. Sometimes it shrank a few feet. Sometimes it grew. Never by much, just enough to notice. He kept notes like a Meister, drew maps, tracked the changes with careful precision. And at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he wondered if the wall had ever really kept winter out, or if it had just held it back, contained it. Now the wall was broken and the Night King was gone, but winter wasn't gone. It was seeping through the cracks, not as an army, as a wound that refused to heal. A month after finding the cold spot, Jon was checking its boundaries when he felt eyes on him. Not the usual feeling of being watched by animals. This was different, older, more patient. He turned slowly. Ghost growled, low and rumbling. They stood at the edge of the trees, 3 of them, small, ancient, their eyes too large for their faces, their skin like bark in certain light. The children of the forest. Jon had seen them during the war. They'd kept their distance then. These ones didn't. They stepped forward, moving with an unnatural grace. The nearest was female. She looked at the cold spot, then at Jon. Her gaze was uncomfortable, like being examined by something that saw too much. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through leaves. The wound spreads. Jon said he was watching it, trying to understand it. She asked why. Why watch a wound he couldn't heal? Jon didn't have a good answer. Because people lived here. Because the free folk deserved safety. Because he'd seen what winter could do. He settled on the simplest truth. It was the right thing to do. The child tilted her head, studying him. The green saw you. The one who was. The one who broke his promise. Jon's jaw tightened. He'd kept his promise. He'd gone north. Her meaning was clear without more words. He'd sworn an oath. To guard the realms of men. The watch wasn't just Castle Black. It was the purpose. The watching. And then you ran. The words hit harder than Jon expected because they were partially true. He'd told himself he was exiled, sent away. But Sansa would have taken him back if he'd asked. Bran would have pardoned him. He could have returned south. He'd chosen this instead. Chosen freedom over duty. The second child spoke. Male, his voice older and tired. Watching is not enough. The third child spoke for the first time. The wound was growing. When it grew large enough, it would demand payment, and Jon would have no choice but to answer or let the cold spread. The children turned to leave. Jon called after them, asking how to seal it, what he was supposed to do. The female child looked back. The old gods remember. Then they were gone, disappearing into the trees. Ghost watched them go, ears flat. Jon stood in the cold and thought about her words. The old gods remember. He thought about the night's watch, about the vows he'd spoken when he'd taken the black. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. Maybe the watch had never been about Castle Black. Maybe it had never been about the wall or the rangers or the brotherhood. Maybe it had always been about this, standing in the cold, watching the wounds that winter left, making sure they didn't spread. He'd run from the watch, but the watch had followed him north, had been waiting for him in this forest, in this clearing, in this wound that needed watching. Purpose followed you. Duty followed you. The person you were meant to be followed you, until you stopped running and turned to face it. Her name was Eva. She was 6 years old, with wild red hair, and her mother's sharp eyes. She'd started following Jon around camp a few weeks ago, asking questions, getting underfoot. Tormund told him the girl's father had died fighting whites at Winterfell. Her mother was struggling. The girl needed someone. So Jon let her follow him, taught her small things, how to tie knots, how to read tracks, how to keep a fire going in, wind. They were checking snares one morning when she asked if he'd really been a king. Jon didn't look at her. He was examining a rabbit caught in one of the traps. Clean kill. For a while. My ma says you ran away. Jon reset the snare. His hands were steady. Your mother's not wrong. So why'd you run? He looked at her then, at the curiosity in her face, the way she was trying to understand. He told her he'd thought home was a place. Castle Black, Winterfell, King's Landing. But it wasn't. Home was what you chose, the people you chose, the life you chose. So this is your home, the forest. Yes, but you're still watching, still guarding. I seen you go to that cold place. Smart girl, too smart. Someone has to watch it. Why you? Because I know what it is, what it could become, and because some duties follow you, even when you run. Eva thought about that. She picked up the rabbit, examining it the way Jon had taught her. I want to learn to watch too, so when I grow up, I can help. Jon felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen for a long time. Promise? Promise. They walked back to camp together, the girl carrying the rabbit, Jon carrying the weight of what he'd just agreed to. He was building something here, not a kingdom, not an army, a watch, a real one, made of people who chose it, who understood that guarding wasn't about walls or vows or black cloaks. It was about standing in the cold and refusing to run. Ghost padded beside them. In the distance, a raven called. Jon didn't look back. He was done running. The first mutiny. The ship was called Winter's Daughter. 60 feet of oak and iron that smelled like salt and tar, and the accumulated sweat of 32 people who'd learned to live in a space smaller than a Winterfell corridor. The planks creaked with every wave. The rigging sang in the wind. At night, when the sea was calm, you could hear the ship breathing. Arya stood at the wheel and watched the horizon swallow the sun. 3 months since they'd left White Harbor. 3 months of nothing but water and sky, and the slow realization that romantic stories about exploration always left out the boredom and the hunger. Gendry approached from below deck. They'd stopped using each other's names a month ago. Ship's discipline required distance. The crew needed to see them as captain and first mate, not old friends who'd once thought about being more. He told her about the rations. They were down to half portions, and the crew was starting to talk, starting to calculate, starting to wonder if their captain knew what she was doing, or if they'd followed a Stark girl to their deaths in the middle of an empty ocean. Arya said they'd find land soon. Had to. The maps ended where the Sunset Sea began, but that didn't mean there was nothing out here. Just meant no one had looked properly. Gendry's expression darkened. He suggested reducing rations to a third, starting tomorrow. Arya knew what that would mean, knew that hunger made people desperate, made them do things they wouldn't consider when their bellies were full. But the alternative was running out completely, was watching people starve while there was still food in the stores. She gave the order. Third rations. Tomorrow. Gendry left without another word. The distance between them had been growing for weeks. Not just between them, between her and everyone on this ship. Command did that. Made you separate. Made you the person who decided who ate and how much and whether that would be enough to keep them alive. The trouble came 3 days later. Arya was in her cabin when she heard shouting. She grabbed her sword, old habit, though she tried to break it, and climbed to the deck. Half the crew had gathered at the mast. Gendry was there. So was Sella, the ship's navigator, and Jorik, a sailor from White Harbor who'd been with them since the beginning. Jorik had a knife. His knuckles were white on the handle. His face was gaunt. They all were, hollow-cheeked and hungry. But his eyes had something else. The kind of desperation that came from realizing you might die out here and no one would ever know. Sella had her hands up. Gendry stood between them. Arya asked what was happening. Her voice cut through the noise the way a blade cuts through cloth. Clean, sharp. Jorik turned to her, said Sella had been hoarding food, had been hiding extra rations in her cabin while the rest of them starved on thirds. He'd found her with the food, had watched her eating when she thought no one was looking. Arya looked at Sella. The navigator was 40, smart, good with stars and tide patterns. Her cabin was next to Arya's. They talked sometimes, late at night, when neither could sleep, about what they'd find when they reached land. She asked if it was true. Sella's face went pale. She admitted she'd saved some, just a little, from her own portions over weeks. She'd been scared they'd never find land, scared she'd die out here. Jorik's voice rose. They were all scared, all starving, but they'd been sharing what little they had while she hoarded, while she stole from the common stores to keep herself fed. The crew was growing, voices rising, angry. Arya could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, and this wouldn't be a dispute anymore. It would be a mutiny. She told Gendry to check Sella's cabin. He went below, came back with a small canvas bag, opened it, hardtack, dried fish, maybe 3 days' worth of full rations, saved over weeks, hidden while everyone else went hungry. The crew's murmurs turned ugly. Someone said she should hang. Someone else said they should put her over the side. Let the sea have her. Arya looked at the bag, at the food that represented survival hoarded while shipmates suffered, at Sella's face, pale and frightened, knowing her life was being weighed against hunger and finding. Ship's law was clear. Hoarding during rationing was theft. Theft could mean lashing, could mean being put ashore if there was shore, could mean death if the crew demanded it. There was no shore, and the crew wanted blood. Arya made her decision, The food would go back to the stores, distributed equally. As for Sela, 10 lashes at sunset, and her rations cut to half for a week. After that, back to equal share with everyone else. Jorik protested, said it wasn't enough, said they should make an example. Arya's voice went cold. They didn't kill their own over 3 days hardtack. They saved that for when it mattered. The crew didn't like it. She could see it in their faces. But they didn't argue. Command wasn't about being loved. It was about being certain. She was certain. At sunset, she tied Sela to the mast herself, gave her a piece of leather to bite. The ship's cook did the lashing. 10 strokes, quick and clean, no showmanship. Sela didn't scream. When it was done, Gendry cut her down, carried her below. Arya stood at the rail and watched the sun sink into the ocean. Behind her, she could hear the crew talking, some still angry, some satisfied. She'd made the right call, probably, but the distance between her and them had grown another inch. Land came 2 weeks later, a smudge on the horizon that turned into cliffs, grey stone rising from grey water, no beaches, no obvious harbour. They sailed along the coast for 3 days before finding a break in the rocks, a narrow inlet that led to a protected bay, sandy shore, fresh water running down from the cliffs. The crew cheered when they dropped anchor. Arya let them. They'd earned it. They spent 2 days recovering, hunting sparse game, gathering what plants they could identify as safe, refilling water barrels until they sloshed. The ship needed repairs too. The storm a week back had cracked 2 boards in the hull, and Gendry spent hours in the bilge with tar and oakum, patching the leaks that could sink them if they weren't careful. On the 3rd day, they saw the people, 5 of them, standing on the cliff above the bay, watching. Arya took Gendry and 6 others, climbed the narrow path to the top. The strangers didn't run. They stood their ground. They were shorter than Westerosi, darker skin, hair like raven feathers. They wore leather and fur and carried spears that looked like bronze, ancient, the kind of metal people used before they learned to work iron. Arya raised her hands, empty, peaceful. The leader, a woman with grey in her hair and the kind of face that had seen too many winters, said something, sharp, questioning. Arya shook her head, pointed to herself, to the ship, made gestures she hoped meant peace, trade, help. The woman spoke again. Different words, a different language. Nothing Arya recognized from Braavos or Essos or anywhere she'd been. This wasn't going to work with words. Gendry did something smart. He pulled out his water skin, drank, offered it. The woman hesitated, then took it, drank, passed it back. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They called themselves something that sounded like Cathara. Or maybe that was their word for people. Communication was difficult. They didn't have trade tongue, didn't know Common or Braavosi or High Valyrian, but they knew gestures, knew gifts. For a week, it went well. The Cathara brought fish, good fish, fat and fresh, the kind that came from knowing the waters. The crew traded needles and rope and one of Gendry's knives. Everyone was careful, polite. Neither side quite trusting but willing to try. Then Ren decided to explore on his own. He came back with his face bloodied and 3 Cathara warriors behind him. They were shouting, pointing, angry in a way that transcended language. Arya met them at the beach. Gendry was trying to calm Ren, who kept saying he didn't mean anything. He just wanted to look around. He didn't know it was forbidden. One of the warriors stepped forward, held something up, a carving, stone, old, worn smooth by hands and weather. It had been on a pedestal in what looked like a shrine inland, sacred ground, and Ren had taken it. Arya felt ice in her stomach. She'd seen shrines before, in Braavos, in the north, knew what it meant when someone violated them, knew that some insults couldn't be smoothed over with apologies or gifts or anything except blood. She turned to Ren, told him to give it back. He tried to explain, said he didn't know, said it was just sitting there, said... She cut him off, told him she didn't care. Give it back. Now. Ren handed over the carving. Arya took it, held it out, to the warrior. The warrior didn't take it. He said something, sharp, final, pointed at the carving, at Ren, at Arya. The grey-haired woman appeared. She spoke to the warrior. A long exchange in their language, quick and heated. He kept shaking his head, kept pointing at Ren. Finally she turned to Arya, made a gesture. Come. Arya followed. Gendry started to join her. She shook her head. This was Captain's work, Captain's responsibility. The woman led her inland, through scrub forest that smelled of salt and pine, to the shrine Ren had violated. It was simple, just a circle of stones and a pedestal carved with symbols Arya didn't recognize. But the ground around it was swept clean, maintained, sacred. The woman pointed to the empty pedestal, to Arya, to the carving in her hands. Arya understood. She had to put it back. But that wasn't all. The woman knelt, bowed her head to the ground, rose, gestured for Arya to do the same. An apology, in their custom, on behalf of her crew. Arya had never been good at apologizing, had spent years learning to stand tall, to never bow, to never show weakness because weakness got you killed. But this wasn't about her. This was about keeping her crew alive, about not starting a war over one stupid sailor's mistake. She knelt, put her head to the ground, felt the dirt against her forehead, rough and cold, stayed there until the woman touched her shoulder. When she rose, the woman took the carving, placed it back on the pedestal, spoke words Arya didn't understand but felt the weight of anyway. A prayer, a blessing, a warning. They walked back to the beach together. The warriors had lowered their spears. The tension had eased. Ren was waiting. Arya grabbed him by the collar, told him if he ever did anything that stupid again, she'd put him in the sea herself. He understood. The Cathara taught them about local waters over the following week, about currents and where storms came from, about an island 2 weeks west where fresh water could be found. They drew maps in the sand, used shells and driftwood to show depths and channels and places where rocks hid just below the surface. In return, the crew taught them about rope making, about Westerosi knots that held under strain. Gendry fixed some of their tools, showed them how to forge a better edge on bronze. One afternoon, the grey-haired woman led Arya to ruins farther inland. Stone foundations half buried in earth and moss. Walls that had crumbled to waist height. A city once, or something like it. The woman spoke in her language. Arya understood nothing, but the woman kept talking, kept pointing to different parts of the ruins, kept touching stones and speaking words that sounded like names. Finally, she drew something in the dirt with a stick, a circle with lines radiating out. Then she pointed to the ruins, to the ocean, to the west. Arya looked at the drawing. The circle could be a sun, or a wheel, or something else entirely. The woman said one word, slow, careful, like she wanted Arya to remember it. It sounded like Valyria, but that was impossible. Valyria was east, across the narrow sea. Valyria was dead, had been for centuries. And yet here was a woman in a land no Westerosi had ever reached, speaking a word that sounded like the greatest empire the world had known. The woman didn't explain further, just led Arya back to the beach, left her with the ruins and the drawing and the impossible word. That night, Arya stood at the rail and thought about it, about what it might mean, about the possibility that the world was stranger and older than any of them knew, that maybe the Age of Heroes wasn't just stories, that maybe there were connections between East and West that predated maps and meisters and everything she'd been taught. Or maybe it was nothing, just a coincidence of sound, just her mind finding patterns where none existed. She didn't know, wouldn't know. That was part of exploration, finding mysteries you couldn't solve, questions you couldn't answer. On the last day, the grey-haired woman gave Arya a gift, a carved piece of driftwood. It showed a ship on waves, crude but careful, made with hands that understood the sea. Arya gave her a silver coin, Bravosi, the only one she had left. The woman turned it over in her hands, examining the strange metal, the unfamiliar symbols. They didn't speak each other's languages, but they understood. The Winter's daughter left at dawn. The Cathara stood on the cliffs and watched them go. Arya stood at the wheel. Gendry joined her. He said they could go back to White Harbour, report what they'd found, let others explore. They'd proven there was land. That was enough. Arya knew he was right. They could go home, could tell Sansa about the Cathara and the ruins and the strange word that might mean nothing, could rest, could stop pushing into the unknown. But she looked at the horizon instead, at the endless water stretching west. Gendry asked how long they were doing this, until they found what they were looking for. And what's that? Arya didn't answer immediately, didn't know if she could put it into words. She was looking for the edge, the place where maps ended and unknown began, the place where she could be no one and everyone at once. But every time they found it, it just became known, mapped, another place to leave behind. Maybe there was no edge. Maybe the world just kept going, kept revealing itself in pieces, and the only choice was whether you kept looking or turned back. She chose to keep looking. Behind them, Sella was working the sails. Her back had healed. The crew had forgiven her, mostly. She moved carefully now, like someone who knew how close they'd come to dying and wasn't eager to test those waters again. Jorik was at the rail, staring west, still hungry. They all were. But the anger had gone out of him. Hunger you could survive. Anger ate you from the inside. Ren was in the hold, doing the work no one else wanted. Penance, he'd learned his lesson. Or he'd learned to hide his mistakes better. Time would tell which. They were still a crew, still moving forward, still choosing the horizon over the harbour. That was enough. The wind picked up. The sails filled. The Winter's daughter cut through the waves, heading west into water no Westerosi had ever sailed. Arya stood at the wheel and felt the ship respond to her hands, felt the weight of command and the lightness of freedom in equal measure. This was what she'd wanted, what she'd always wanted. Not a home, not a place, but movement, discovery, the constant unfolding of a world that was bigger and stranger than anyone knew. And if it cost her, if every choice meant someone lost something, if every day brought new crises that needed solving, well, that was the price of the horizon. She paid it gladly. The sun rose behind them. The west stretched ahead, endless, unknown, perfect. Brother and sister. Old Wex had been hunting the Wolfswood for 40 years. He knew every deer trail, every hollow where rabbits nested, every place the snow melted first in spring. He'd walked these paths in summer heat and winter cold, had learned to read the forest the way maesters read books. But he'd never seen tracks like these. They were massive, bigger than any wolf he'd ever known, bigger than seemed possible for an animal that walked on four legs. Each print was pressed deep into the snow, the pads clear and distinct, the claw marks visible at the tips. Fresh tracks, maybe a few hours old. His son Mark stood beside him. The boy was 16, brave in the way young men were brave, without understanding what bravery cost. He wanted to follow the tracks, wanted to see what had made them. Wex said no, said this wasn't the kind of wolf you hunted. This was the kind that hunted you. But Mark was already moving, following the tracks with the confidence of someone who'd never seen what real predators could do, who thought size meant slow, thought big meant easy to avoid. Wex cursed and followed. They tracked for an hour. The prince led them deep into the wood, where the trees grew so thick the snow barely reached the ground. Here, the tracks joined others. A dozen wolves, maybe more, all of them huge. Wex grabbed his son's shoulder. Time to go back, now. Then they heard it, a howl, deep, resonant. It echoed through the trees like thunder rolling across a valley. Every wolf in the pack answered. Wex pulled Mark behind a fallen log. They crouched, waited. Wex's hand was tight on his son's arm, keeping him still, keeping him quiet. The pack appeared like ghosts. Huge wolves, each one bigger than any Wex had seen in 40 years of hunting. Their fur was silver and grey and black. Their eyes caught the light wrong, too bright, too knowing. And in the center, leading them, a she-wolf the size of a pony. Wex knew what he was seeing. Everyone north of the neck knew the stories. Nymeria, the Stark girl's wolf, the one that had vanished into the wild years ago and become something more than animal, something that walked the line between beast and legend. The pack moved past them, silent except for the soft padding of enormous paws on snow. They were hunting something, moving with purpose, with intent. Wex and Mark stayed hidden until the wolves were gone. Then they ran, made it back to their cabin by sunset. Wex barred the door, lit every lamp they had. Mark asked what that was. His voice shook. "Justice," Wex said. The boy didn't understand. Wex didn't explain. Some things you had to see to believe. 2 days later, they heard the news. A group of bandits had been found torn apart in the woods. 6 men who'd been raiding villages along the White Knife. Stealing, burning, killing. No one mourned them. And everyone knew what had done it. The stories spread faster than fire. The great she-wolf and her pack. How they hunted the wicked. How they protected the innocent. How they were the Stark's vengeance made flesh. Most of it was nonsense, but some was true. Nymeria's pack had grown over the years. Wolves bred. Pups scattered through the north. Some stayed with the pack. Others went feral, living solitary lives in the deep woods. A few, the rare ones, bonded with people, and some people saw opportunity. Lord Serwyn's youngest son trapped 3 wolf pups near Last Hearth. They were huge, even as pups, their paws oversized, their eyes already showing that uncanny brightness. Clearly from Nymeria's line, clearly worth something to the right buyer. He brought them to a merchant in White Harbor, a man who dealt in exotic animals, rare birds from the summer isles, shadow cats from the mountains of the moon, things that southern lords wanted to show they were powerful and different. The merchant paid well, gold enough to last a winter. Gold enough that word got around. More hunters went looking for pups, found them in dens and hollows, caught them young before they grew too large to handle, sold them to merchants who sold them to lords who wanted something fierce to guard their keeps or impress their rivals. By the end of summer, there were direwolf pups in cages from Old Town to Lannisport. Some died in captivity. Some were killed when they grew too large, too dangerous, too expensive to feed. None were treated well. The trade was profitable, and it was killing Nymeria's bloodline one pup at a time. Ghost territory was north of the wall. Proper north, where the land turned to tundra and ice and the trees gave up trying. He'd fathered 7 litters over the years. The pups scattered. Some died to cold or hunger or the normal cruelty of nature. Others survived, grew strong. A few stayed near their father's range. Jon knew about them. He'd seen them on his ranging trips. White and grey shapes moving through the snow. Ghost's children and grandchildren. He'd left them alone. They were wild. That was right. That was how it should be. Then the trappers came. 3 men from beyond the gift. Sellswords, maybe. Or deserters. Hard to tell. They'd built a camp on the edge of ghost territory. Set snares and traps designed for large prey. Jon wouldn't have cared about rabbit traps. But these were made for bigger game. He found the first wolf in a steel trap. One of Ghost's daughters. Her leg was broken. She'd chewed halfway through it trying to escape, trying to free herself, even if it meant leaving part of herself behind. Jon killed her quick. Mercy was all he could offer. He found the trappers that night, tracked them back to their camp. They had 3 more wolves in cages, pups, maybe 6 months old, young enough to be worth something, old enough to survive the journey south. The men were drunk, celebrating their catch, talking about the gold they'd get in White Harbor, about what they'd spend it on. Jon walked into their firelight with Ghost at his side. The direwolf's eyes reflected red in the flames. The men went for weapons. Jon was faster. His sword took the first one's hand off. The second got his throat opened. The third ran. Ghost brought him down. Jon opened the cages. The pups fled into the dark. They'd survive or they wouldn't, but they'd be free. He left the bodies where they fell, took their steel. Good weapons shouldn't go to waste. Burned their camp so thoroughly that nothing remained but ash and scorched earth. 3 days later, Tormund asked where he'd been. Ranging, Jon said. Tormund looked at the new sword on Jon's belt, at the blood still under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing had quite removed. Right, ranging. He didn't ask again. That winter, a new song started spreading through the northern villages. No one knew who wrote it. It just appeared, sung in taverns and around fires, passed from one singer to the next like stories had been passed for thousands of years. It was about wolves, brother and sister, Ghost and Nymeria, the white wolf beyond the wall and the grey wolf in the wood. How they watched the north, protected it, how their children spread like snow across the land. The song said they were the old gods returned, nature's justice. The price of wickedness made flesh and fur and fang. Most of it was fantasy. Wolves were wolves. They hunted to eat. They killed to survive. They didn't understand justice or mercy or any of the complicated things humans invented to explain the world. But the song took hold anyway, because people needed to believe in something, needed to think that somewhere in the dark, something was watching over them, something that punished the wicked and protected the innocent, something that remembered when the laws forgot. The truth was simpler and stranger. Nymeria hunted because she was a wolf, because wolves hunted. But she'd grown up with a Stark, had learned to read humans in ways wild wolves never did. She could smell fear and cruelty, could sense when someone was prey not because they were weak, but because they were wrong. The bandits she killed weren't hunted because they were wicked. They were hunted because they smelled like violence, because their fear was the fear of predators, not prey, because something in Nymeria's wolf brain recognized them as threats to the things she protected, not consciously, not with purpose, but with the same instinct that told her when to hunt and when to den and when to howl. Ghost was different. He'd always been different. Quieter, more patient. He hunted alone or with Jon, rarely with other wolves. His children inherited that solitude. They ranged wide, claimed their own territories, lived and died in the wild, without ever knowing their father had once walked the halls of Winterfell. But both wolves had spread their blood through the north, had created something new, not quite wild, not quite tame. Direwolves that were larger and stranger than regular wolves, that lived longer and bred true, that carried in their blood the echo of the bond between Stark and wolf. In another generation, there might be hundreds. In 2 generations, thousands. The North would belong to them again, the way it had in the Age of Heroes before men pushed the great beast to the edge of extinction. The wolves didn't know they were rebuilding what had been lost. They just lived, hunted, bred, survived. But the North knew. The North remembered. On a night when the moon was full and the snow was falling soft, a howl rose from beyond the wall, deep and resonant. The sound of a direwolf calling to something only he could hear. Miles south, in the wolfswood, another howl answered, higher, different. The voice of a she-wolf who'd once been named and loved, and had chosen the wild over civilization. The 2 sounds didn't meet, couldn't meet. The distance was too great, the land between too vast. But they were the same pack, had always been the same pack. Brother and sister, separated by choice and fate and the complicated weight of being more than animal, less than human. Jon heard Ghost's howl and stopped what he was doing, stood in the cold and listened, felt something in his chest tighten and release. Somewhere far south, Arya woke in her cabin aboard the Winter's Daughter, sat up in the dark, heard something that couldn't be there, a howl that came from memory rather than the ocean outside. She went back to sleep, dreamed of grey fur and running in the forest, where she'd learned to be no one and someone all at once. Sansa heard nothing. She was too far from the wild, too deep in the work of ruling. But she looked at the direwolf on her seal and thought of summer snows and siblings scattered, and the promise her father had made about the pack surviving. They'd survived, all of them, in different ways, in different places, but the pack endured. The wolves knew it, the North knew it, and on cold nights when the wind was right, you could hear them calling to each other across the miles. Brother and sister, Ghost and Nymeria, the white and the grey. The song got that part right. The last hour. The raven arrived at Winterfell on a morning without wind, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry too far, made every movement feel watched. Sansa was in her solar reviewing trade agreements when Maester Jerryn brought it. The message was short, too short, written in a hand so precise it looked carved rather than penned. Each letter perfect, each word exactly spaced. The handwriting of someone who saw time differently, who could plan every stroke before the quill touched parchment. The Isle of Faces, 3 days hence. Come alone. Bring no guards. Your brother requires your presence. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Sansa read it 3 times. The precision bothered her more than the words. Bran had always been careful with his writing, even as a boy. But this was different. This was the work of someone who'd forgotten how to be imperfect. She asked when it arrived. The Maester said an hour ago. Said the raven looked strange. Older than any bird should be, its eyes too knowing, like it had seen things birds shouldn't see. Sansa dismissed him. Sat alone with the message. Bran hadn't written to her in 6 months. Their last correspondence had been about trade routes, dry and formal. The words of a king to a queen, not a brother to a sister. This was different. This was a summons, and something about it made her skin prickle. She should refuse, should demand more information, should send word to King's Landing asking what this was about. But she knew she wouldn't, because whatever this was, whatever Bran needed, it was important enough that he'd broken 6 months of silence to ask for it. She left the next morning, took a small escort as far as the twins, sent them back, continued south alone on a horse that knew the road. The journey took 4 days. 4 days of riding through a realm that was rebuilding, slowly, like a body healing from a deep wound. Villages were being rebuilt. Fields were being worked. People were trying to remember how to live without war. Sansa rode through it all and thought about her brother, about the boy who'd loved to climb, who'd been kind and curious and alive in ways that seemed impossible now. She wondered what was left of that boy, whether anything remained, or if the 3-eyed raven had consumed him completely, leaving only a shell that wore his face and spoke with his voice, but felt nothing he'd once felt. The Isle of Faces sat in the middle of the God's Eye, a place where weirwood still grew thick, where the children of the forest had made their last stand against the First Men ages ago, before the Pact brought peace, where the old gods still watched. A boat waited at the shore. No ferryman, just a small craft tied to a post, rocking gently in the water. Sansa got in. The boat moved on its own, slow, steady, across water that reflected the sky like polished silver. The weirwoods covered the island, hundreds of them, their white bark stark against green, leaves and red. The air tasted different here, old, heavy with something Sansa couldn't name. She walked paths she didn't remember knowing, followed a pull she couldn't explain. Her feet carried her forward like they knew where to go, even if her mind didn't. She found Bran in the center, in a grove where 9 weirwoods grew in a circle, their branches intertwining overhead to create a ceiling of bone-white wood and blood-red leaves. He sat in his chair, eyes closed, hands resting on the arms like he was carved from the same wood as the trees around him. "Bran," she said softly. His eyes opened. For a moment, just a heartbeat. They were her brother's, grey, tired, human. Then they shifted, became something else, deeper, older, like looking into a well with no bottom. "Sansa." His voice was Bran's, mostly. "Thank you for coming. Your message was concerning." Was it? He tilted his head. The gesture was wrong, too bird-like. "I thought it was clear." It was. That's what concerned me. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "You're still you. That's good. I was worried." "Worried about what?" "That ruling would change you, the way it's changing me." Sansa felt cold settle in her chest. She looked at her brother. Really looked at him. His face was the same, his body, but something essential was different, missing, like he was a painting of Bran rather than Bran himself. "What's happening to you?" I'm becoming what I need to be." He paused. The pause was too calculated, like he'd planned exactly how long to wait before speaking again. "The kingdom needs a king who sees everything, who knows what's coming, who can prevent the mistakes before they're made. It's effective. Tyrion has noticed. The small council, they think I'm wise, insightful. You are wise. No, the three-eyed raven is wise. Bran Stark is fading." The words were matter-of-fact, clinical, like he was describing someone else's death instead of his own. "I wanted you here," Bran continued, "because I wanted to try something. Before I'm completely gone. Before I forget what it's like to be family." The weirwoods around them began to whisper, not with voices, with presence. The air thickened. The light changed. 2 figures appeared between the trees, not solid, not quite real, but there. Jon, standing with his hand on Ghost's head, his furs white with snow, his face weathered by northern cold. Arya, salt-stained and sun-dark, a sailor's calluses on her palms, her hair longer than Sansa remembered, tied back with a leather cord. Sansa's breath caught. "Are they really here?" "In a way. I'm showing you what the trees see, what the old gods know. Jon is beyond the wall. Arya is very far west. But here, in this place, we can all be together. One last time." Jon's image looked at her. His eyes were sad. "Sansa," her voice cracked. "Jon." Arya grinned. "You got old. You got lost. I'm finding things, same as being found." They stood there, the 4 Starks, connected by something older than words, deeper than blood. The trees, the old magic, the bonds that held even when continents separated them. "I wanted you to see this," Bran said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, almost human. "Wanted you to know what I can do, what I've been doing." "Which is?" Sansa asked. "Ruling, really ruling." He paused. "I see things before they happen, the plots before they form, the famines before they start, the wars before the first sword is drawn, and I stop them. A word in the right ear, a letter at the right time. The kingdom is stable because I make it stable." "That's good," Jon said, "isn't it? It's effective, but it's not human." Bran looked at each of them in turn. "I don't sleep anymore. Don't eat unless Tyrion reminds me. Don't feel things the way I used to. Joy, anger, fear. They're fading, like colours in old cloth." "Then stop," Arya said. "Come back. Be Bran again." "I can't. The kingdom needs this, needs me to be this, and I'm not sure. I remember how to be anything else." Sansa stepped closer to her brother, the real one, the one sitting in the chair. "Is that why you brought us here? To tell us goodbye?" "Partially." He looked at each of them. "But also to ask you something. When I'm completely gone, when there's nothing left of Bran Stark and only the three-eyed raven remains, will you still love me?" The question hung in the air. Impossible. Heartbreaking. Jon answered first. "You'll always be my brother, even if you forget it." Arya nodded. "Pack is pack. Doesn't matter what you become." Sansa knelt in front of the wheelchair, took Bran's hands. They were cold, always cold now. "I'll love you," she said, "but I'll also grieve, because the brother I knew is dying, and I can't stop it. No one can." Bran's eyes were wet, human tears on an inhuman face, the last proof that something of her brother still remained. "But knowing you'll remember, that helps." The images of Jon and Arya faded like smoke in wind. The weirwood stopped whispering. Sansa was alone with Bran in the grove. "There's something else," he said. "Something I need to tell you. Something you can never repeat." Sansa felt dread settle in her stomach. "What is it?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so soft, she almost didn't hear it. "I saw paths where fewer died, and I did not choose them." The words were simple. The meaning was terrible. "What do you mean?" "The wars, the long night, all of it. I could have..." He trailed off, started again. "I saw it coming, saw ways to warn people sooner, saw messages I could have sent, words I could have spoken, ways to save thousands, tens of thousands. Why didn't you?" "Because those paths led to worse endings, different wars, different deaths. The world needed to break the way it did, needed the old patterns to end, the old houses, the old grudges." He paused. "The three-eyed raven isn't just a witness. It's a gardener, pruning, shaping, making things grow the way they need to." Sansa wanted to be sick, wanted to scream, wanted to call him a monster and leave and never look back. But she couldn't, because she understood. In a horrible, perfect way, she understood. She'd made choices too, hard choices. The dog for the man, stability over mercy, 1,000 small decisions where she'd chosen what worked over what felt right. Bran had just made harder ones, on a larger scale, with more blood. "Does anyone else know?" she asked. "Tyrion suspects. He's clever enough to see the pattern, but he doesn't want to know for certain. Knowing would require him to act, and he knows I'm keeping the realm stable. That matters more than how I do it. So we just let you be this? You don't have a choice. Neither do I. This is what we are now, what we have to be." Sansa stood. She looked at her brother, her king, the thing he was becoming. "I won't tell anyone," she said, "but I won't forgive you either." "I know." His voice was small, human. "I don't forgive myself." The boat took her back across the God's Eye. Sansa rode north alone. She didn't stop in inns, didn't speak to anyone on the road, just rode and thought and tried to process what she'd learned. Her brother was dying, had maybe already died. What remained was something else, something that saw people as pieces on a board, moved them according to some vast plan only it could see. And the worst part was that it worked. The realm was stable. The wars were over. People were rebuilding. Because a boy had become a god and decided their suffering was worth the peace that followed. When she reached Winterfell, she locked herself in her solar, sat in the dark, tried to find a way to carry what she now knew. By morning, she decided, this was a burden she'd carry alone. Some truths couldn't be shared. Some secrets were too heavy to pass on. She had a council meeting, trade disputes to settle, letters to answer, a kingdom to run. She did her work. She ruled her north. And she carried Bran's secret like a stone in her chest. Some nights, she'd stand on the battlements and look south toward King's Landing. Wonder if her brother was sitting in his throne room, seeing the future, making his careful adjustments to keep the realm from tearing itself apart. Wonder if he still remembered her, still remembered any of them, or if he'd finally completed his transformation. If the last pieces of Bran Stark had finally faded, leaving only the raven behind. She'd never know. That was part of the wait, the not knowing, the wondering if the person she'd grieved for was truly gone, or if some small part of him remained, trapped inside the thing he'd become. But the work didn't stop. The North needed her. Her people needed her. And she would be there for them, carrying weights they'd never know about, making choices they'd never understand, ruling in the way she'd learned from her father and her mother, and everyone who taught her that duty meant sacrifice. The snow fell. Winter came. Winter left. The years turned, and Sansa Stark ruled the North with the secret locked tight in her chest, never spoken, never shared. Some burdens couldn't be lightened. They could only be carried. She carried hers until the end.